Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Mia. I'm a member of the research team here at the People's Forum. And for those of you who've never been here before, the People's Forum is a political and popular education space that works to unite the struggles of the international working class. We're very excited to have Maher here to discuss his new book, A World Without Police: How Strong Communities Make Cops Obsolete. Gio is a writer, organizer, and a visiting associate professor of political science at Vassar College. And his previous books include We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolution, and Decolonizing Dialectics. Joining us to talk about the current situation of anti-police brutality organizing is Kerbie Joseph. Kerbie is a community organizer with the Answer Coalition and currently works at the Audre Lorde Project as a coordinator of the Safe Outside the System program. Kerbie is also a lead organizer in the Justice for Akai Gurley Family campaign and has worked with many police brutality families in New York City. Thank you both so much for being here. And copies of Gio's book are available at the front of our bookstore, 1804 Books. And if you're tuning in on live stream tonight, you can submit questions for the Q&A later via the YouTube chat box. And we will also have time for audience Q&A. And with that, I'll pass it on to Gio to introduce the book, and then Kerbie will speak about her organizing work.
Cool. Thank you so much, Mia, for organizing this to the People's Forum. I think I'm just going to say a few words. By the end of those words, I think it'll be obvious why this is a really great place to be launching this book into the world. And thank you to Kerbie for being here to enlighten all of us on what's going on in the city. Me in particular, who doesn't live here, I would love to hear more about what's happening. Just by way of introduction, again, I don't want to speak too much. I want a good conversation afterward. I'll just say that that the book really comprises, for me, three pieces. The first of which is diagnosing, in a way, the world that we live in today, which I call the world of police, a world shaped by and built around policing, a world in which police are understood to be the only alternative that we have for all social problems, mental health problems, lack of social welfare funding, lack of after-school activities. The police are called in as the sort of single solution to every single problem. Against that world of police, I also want to speak a bit about the world without police, the world that we're trying to build, the sort of abolitionist fabric of a new society that already exists in a certain way, but we're also trying to expand, stitch together, and generalize as an alternative to this world. Thirdly, though, I really want to center the question of how do we get there from here? And I think, while a great deal of abolitionist work and literature has emphasized the prefigurative question of building a new society, we also need to think very, very seriously about what kind of struggles will be required to get us from this world to the world without police that we want to inhabit. It's difficult, I think, to lay out all the pieces as quickly as I want to. But from a historical standpoint, one thing that I always try to emphasize is the fact that the world that we inhabit, the world that we live in, is the product of the failures of the Reconstruction era. And that this tells us a lot about the police, not only in the emergence and development of those police forces, but also in the specific kind of role that they played. So, rough overview, and here I draw very directly and constantly referring back to W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, which is really an essential text that everyone needs to read again, digest. The Civil War ended with the possibility of a radical, revolutionary, multiracial democracy in the South that brought greater opportunities, greater equality to everyone. All people of all races, all genders, women, children, white, black, across the South. That possibility, that experiment in radical, what Du Bois called abolition democracy, a very specific kind of what happens to democracy when white supremacy is pushed back, that was defeated, it was destroyed by white terrorism. That white terrorism had a name, and that name was the Klan. But it also was the origins and the emergence in that moment of what have come to be the police of today. A lot of people talk about the role of slave patrols earlier, but it's in this moment and out of this great betrayal that Du Bois documents, in which poor white people in particular sacrificed their own class interests to side with the bosses, to side with their own oppressors in the name of white solidarity. This is where the police come from for all intents and purposes, and it tells us a great deal about where we are today and what the police do. Reconstruction is also crucial because what we saw in that moment was, in a way, the fact that abolition and Reconstruction always need to be part of the same project. You can try to tear down an institution, you can abolish that institution, but if you haven't rebuilt and reconstructed the kind of society that would exist, in which those institutions would be, as I put it, following Angela Davis, obsolete, then you haven't created a situation in which those institutions will not simply be recreated under another name. So what happened? Former slaves are abandoned to the whims of racial capitalism, forced into sharecropping, incarcerated, imprisoned, subject to convict labor and convict leasing, and ultimately to what we know today as the sort of massive over-policing, hyper-policing, and hyper-incarceration that we live in today. This all grows out of that moment, and the police have played a fundamental role in upholding and expanding this world of policing ever since. That's the second thing that I want to emphasize. The world of police that we live in has not always existed. We haven't always had police. Even after they were invented and created, they didn't enjoy control over as many spheres of our life as they do today. There were not always police in schools. There were not always police on college campuses, in public libraries. The world of police has expanded over the past 100 years and has come to take over and naturalize the presence of police in all these different spheres. This is something that we can talk about, and also a good question in terms of organizing, pushing the police out of these spaces. Fundamentally, when I say a world of police, and this is part of why it's so great to be here in the People's Forum, we're talking about an actual world. In other words, we're talking about global policing. We're talking about an institution of policing domestically that has always been embedded and intertwined with global counterinsurgency, US imperialism, the outsourcing of US interests to domestic policing across the globe, and the ways in which these have been intimately bound together from day one. We're talking about the ways in which policing is counterinsurgency, and counterinsurgency has always been a form of policing, in the words of Stuart Schrader, who has written an excellent book on the subject. This is the world that we're talking about. It's a world of constantly expanding police power. And this gets us to the question of what the alternative to that, I think, looks like. And here I'll try to be, as brief as possible. Again, what Reconstruction and the failures of Reconstruction teach us is that we need to build a new kind of world. That we need to build different structures and institutions in our society so that policing is, again, obsolete. What does obsolete mean? It means you create a situation in which that repressive carceral institution simply doesn't make sense. If you have a world of equality, if you have a world that is not divided by racial hierarchies, that's not divided and fundamentally striated by class inequality, by patriarchy, why would you need the police? The police exist to uphold and to patrol and guard those inequalities, without which the institution ceases to have any kind of relevance. That's the kind of world that we're trying to build, that we need to build. As I said at the beginning, that world already exists. It exists in a whole range of institutions, from top to bottom of our world and our society, but which are crowded out and which are made to seem irrelevant from the perspective of the world of policing. Safe outside the system is a great example, and there are examples across the country. There are alternatives to divert 911 calls, particularly for mental health crises, away from the police. There are alternatives that exist to, of course, intervene fundamentally in neighborhood conflicts before they begin. And the task that stands before us in terms of building this alternative involves building from the very ground level up. It involves building from your block, from your neighborhood. It involves connecting with neighbors. It involves creating a kind of rapid response network so that if you see the police in your community, you all can connect and discuss and figure out what to do about it. And that network also, and here's the fundamental piece, is the groundwork for a new kind of society in which if there's a community conflict, that can be resolved. If there's a domestic conflict, that can be resolved within the community without inviting these violent sort of guardians of order into our communities. There's a lot to say about what the police do and do not do. A big part of the book is dedicated to debunking the fact that the police do anything at all to make communities safer. They do not. They don't protect, even those members of society that they claim to protect. They exist primarily to protect property and to protect whiteness. They don't protect women, they don't protect homeless people, they don't protect anyone who's having a mental health crisis. And the statistics on all of these sort of different sectors of society that are brutalized more than they're protected by the police are absolutely stunning and should be, I think, discussed and documented even further. The question, though, is how do we get from here to there? What kind of political strategy can we develop? And here I really do, in the book, make an argument for thinking strategically, for thinking about the question of power in particular. I don't think it's enough to build these alternatives. I don't think it's enough to build small, safe spaces throughout our society without breaking and cracking the foundations of police power in that society. In the book, my primary target, if you had to pick one, is the so-called police unions. It's the Fraternal Order of Police. It's the so-called benevolent associations that are nothing, there's nothing benevolent about them, right? These are violent, fascistic institutions. And again, it's not that they simply exist to protect the interests of police. These are the institutions that have been expanding the power of police for a century. These are the institutions that have been spreading the ideology of policing. The Fraternal Order of Police here, and again, the benevolent officers associations, patrolmen's associations, what they do is they negotiate on a local level impunity and ever-increasing budgets, salaries for police as a special part of society, as special, as a special and privileged sector that exists to fundamentally stitch together this white supremacist power that is our society. And it's on the basis of that special position that they can claim special privileges and expand those privileges. There's an argument about so-called police unions where some of them are part of union federations. I think that's absolute bullshit. I think we need to be very clear about the fact that police unions need to be expelled from the labor movement. They need to be understood as what they are, which is uniformed strikebreakers. They are the violent enemies of the workers and enemies of poor people of color in particular, which are the majority of the global working class. And we need to be clear on that, and we need to fundamentally work to absolutely annihilate their power and to make them an irrelevant presence to our society as the beginning of a strategy of pushing back on the world of police and expanding the world without. Again, we're talking about the world as the global, the global sphere, as the structure of policing that exists on a global level, and we're also talking about global resistance. And here, I like to argue, and I need to argue that abolition, which is often framed in very US-centric terms, needs to be constantly in conversation with global anti-imperialist struggles and needs to be in conversation with global struggles for community self-defense, community self-determination. Of course, these have always been at the heart of the black struggle in the US as well, but we don't want to disconnect them from, for example, what I document in the book, which are self-defense, community self-defense movements in Mexico, in Northern Ireland, in South Africa, in Venezuela, experiments in what it looks like to actually rid entire communities of the police by building an alternative kind of power, by building a democratic, grassroots, armed power that's capable of keeping the police at bay and keeping the community safe at the same time. The last thing that I will say is that if we're talking about policing domestically in the US, if we're talking about policing as a global institution, we of course cannot forget the fact that at the interface of the two, there lay a violent institution, which is the border, and police abolition is also ICE abolition, is also border patrol abolition, and is also fundamentally the abolition of the border itself. Again, there are arguments that claim to be on the left that try to say that, well, the border exists and it protects workers and it helps to defend our salaries, and that's also complete and utter bullshit. What the border does, just like what white supremacy does, is to separate, distinguish, segment the working class, which is a division that the bosses use for their control, right? It is the policing of the border. It is border enforcement that drives down wages, that forces people to work in obscurity, that forces people to work under unprotected conditions, and that weakens the entire working class struggle as a whole. Again, we need to think bigger when it comes to what working class struggles look like. We have to think about the global working class as extending beyond borders, as this global multiracial, primarily and majority people of color, poor people of color. We do not need police in our movements. We do not need their representatives and so-called unions in our movements. And we do not need nativist sentiments that would uphold the border at the expense of the global majority in our movements. We need to begin working today, continue to struggle on the basis of the struggles that are already unfolding. And I want to hear, obviously, more about what's going on in New York to weaken police power, to push through those changes and those transformations that point toward abolition, that break police power, that undermine police power. We need to refuse those so-called reforms that only uphold police power, that strengthen police power. It's not about training. It's not about body cameras. It's not about so-called community policing. These are all diversions. They've all been proposed 100 times before, and all they do is uphold the legitimacy of the police. We need those defunding measures. We need those transformations that do weaken the foundations of police power, that weaken the institutions and the spearheads of that power, and that help us then to expand the organizing on the grassroots level that will provide the basis for the new world that's developing in the shell of the old. Thank you.
I don't have a speech prepared. So, but how is everybody doing? Everybody's good? Okay, and everyone can hear me? Okay. One of the things that I want to uplift just in terms of what you were saying about the Reconstruction, just to go back to it again, is that the Reconstruction showed the failure of this government to protect poor, working class, Black, Indigenous people. The government had a choice to keep the South safe, to allow white supremacy to fall back, to allow people to develop their communities, to allow former slaves to develop homes, and they said no. And this is the institution that we currently are indoctrinated by, one that is inherently racist, one that does not care about our community, one that does not care about our safety. And that's where the police come from. And that's what Jill was saying. He was making it very, very clear that police come from a slave catcher occupation. That's what their job was, right? The reason why it's called a beat is because they used to beat slaves back to their masters, right? So we were always looked at as criminals, as expendable. So when people talk about reforming police, what we have to always take into consideration is that the police comes from that basis, a basis of hate, a basis of violence, a basis of vengeance. If anybody here is an abolitionist, I don't know, people, if y'all want to put your hands up and out yourselves, if you're an abolitionist or a communist or a socialist, any ist, except right wing, those are not welcome here. But if you do believe in that, then you have to believe in the end of this system. That is the first fundamental step. And it's not that you can have reforms under this system, but the goal is to be rid of this system to create something new, right? If you put water in shit, it's just watery shit. Does that make sense? Great. Y'all like, ew, watery shit. I'm just saying. It's true. Right now in New York City, the NYPD only solves 2% of all crime in the city, right? So they got $6 billion extra within their budget to play around with. They claim that they defunded the police. They just moved that into police into schools. I'm gonna get to that a little bit later. So a city of 9 million people on the edge of New York State, as the media sit here and claims that the police are so needed and they only solve 2% of crimes. 2. If we only did 2% of our jobs, what would happen? You would get fired, right? Somebody had to call you in, right? What's going on? You're not doing your job. Also, the media does a great job in saying that crime is at an all-time high in New York City, right? That people are shooting each other, that there's violence, all this stuff happening. Actually, New York City right now is at the lowest crime rate it's been in 40 years. Lowest. Now, we know the media is the fourth branch of government. We know that, right? And it's not our media. It's not stuff like Breakthrough. It's not things that are happening here in TPF. We're talking about Viacom. We're talking about Fox, right? Who sit here and gaslight our communities to believe that we need more police. Another thing I want to uplift is that a lot of that propaganda came after and during the uprising. right? So let's go back a year. So right now we're 2 years into the pandemic. We're 1 year after George Floyd. Can't even believe it, right? Last summer, we entered what is considered the largest civil rights movement struggle in our country's history. It was a global struggle. There's a George Floyd mural in Palestine right now. There's a George Floyd mural in Haiti right now. I'm Haitian. Even though we were in complete lockdown, we were like, what, 2-3 months into lockdown, right? We were forced to go onto the streets because of the level of police violence that we saw. And the only reason why there was any type of sentencing is because of that struggle. It's because of everyone here that took the streets, that organized, that coordinated, right? Let's talk about de Blasio for a second. Oh, de Blasio. And the reason why I'm uplifting him is because during that struggle, he told us to stop being in the street. He said, okay, we get it. Go back home now, right? Even though he allowed police to have carte blanche to violently assault community members if they did not have their mask on, if they were not 6 feet apart, socially distancing. So while we watched George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade die, de Blasio allowed more violence into our community while single-handedly saying that he was going to defund the police. It's a contradiction there. So then we can't say that we want a world without police and then not say that we need a different system altogether, knowing that electeds are allowing for the abuse of the same people that vote for them. Does that make sense? Okay. I want to also uplift that in New York City, there has been a handful of indictments. What does that mean? Meaning that there's only been a handful of police officers that have been charged for a crime committed, no matter what we saw. We all saw Eric Garner say he couldn't breathe. It took years to get an indictment. And you actually paid for those officers' retirement. Lucky us, right? Akai Gurley, and I'm going to talk about that case in a little bit, is a case that I have led with the family since 2014. I know a lot of people here from that struggle. It's the only case that there was an indictment and a guilty verdict from the jury in New York City, only. And the judge reversed that decision with motivation from the DA. Former DA Ken Thompson, who sat down with the police brutality family, the Akai Gurley family, and said that there were going to be justice. He said that. And literally, instead of the jail time that the jury, right? What do they say? Land of the free, what is it? Justice, right? All of that, Statue of Liberty, chains at her feet, right? You have to let the justice system work, right? That is what they tell us. In the Akai Gurley case, there was a trial. Because of struggle, that trial got to court. There was a trial after 1 year of struggle, which is huge. The Garner family is still fighting. There was a verdict from the jury of guilty. Never happened before. There was a recommendation of sentencing of at least 5 years of prison time. And the judge and the DA reversed it. Right? So for us, something that we have to understand is that it is not just reading about it, it's fighting for it. It's praxis. Who knows who Asada is? Asada Shakur, cute lady, gallivanting in Cuba, because she is, trust me. Trust me, her skin looks very clear. Asada said, theory without practice is deceit. You can't just talk about it, you gotta organize about it. And with the struggle for shifting police culture, most importantly, shifting what they represent, white supremacy, we have to be organized. On all angles. If you are a writer, write for struggle. If you're a dancer, dance for struggle. If you are an organizer like me, let's go organize some shit. Whatever we can get it done, right? If you deal with healing justice, heal the organizers so they can go back out and fight. There are different ways that everybody can participate in struggle on a whole scale so we can shift something. And that's what last summer represented. Last summer represented hundreds of millions of people using every skill that they had to impact one case. Because we're dealing with the machine that not only has the media, but has our tax dollars to fund it, that provides weaponry, right? We don't have tasers, we don't have guns, we don't have batons, we don't have cuffs. Some people might have cuffs, but not for what we're talking about. That's a whole nother panel. Audre Lorde talks about joy, whatever. Anyway, we have to use our skills to affect change. All our skills. Because all we have is our numbers to develop people power. And Gio was mentioning this. Power is the ability to get something done. That is what power is, in the simplest terms. And the only reason why our chants, our words, our imagery became popular is because we had so many people together for this struggle that they had to take notice. You couldn't turn anywhere without seeing the police brutality struggle impacted all over this country. Whether you're for or against it, 2020 was all about police violence. 2019 was all about abolition, especially in New York City. There were groups that came up, some are around, some are not. But the main focus of those groups were talking about abolition work. Quoting Angela Davis, right? Miss Gilbert, right? And it's not because it was a new concept, but because things shifted and people wanted something new. Okay, it's not working. De Blasio's talking about the Tale of Two Cities. Who remembers that 8 years ago? He had his little black children all up in the commercials. Who remember that, right? Somebody just sucked their teeth. People are upset. But like, you know, used our sympathies, used our compassion, right, to get a vote. But then still increase the police budget. Eric Adams, that's not my mayor. Don't know about y'all. Eric Adams is backed by the biggest police union in the country. That's his interest. He posted today about Bitcoin. He said New York City is about to be cryptocurrency city. But yet 1 million people are facing eviction. Police violence happens every 28 hours. And workers don't have any health care, but you're concerned about cryptocurrency. It's clear our interests aren't in the minds of people who use our power. And your vote is a power to uplift their agenda. So if we're gonna fight, oh, these are pictures. I was like, wait, what? So if we're gonna fight against police violence, we have to come across a common agenda. One, and this is my opinion, based on my experience, and we can talk about it later. One, we have to be talking about anti-state. What do I mean by state? I mean the police. I mean the military. I mean the courts. I mean institutions like colleges. That's the state. The things that make us think how we do and allow things to function how they do. That is a state, right? So we have to be anti-state. So we have to go against that. Two, we have to be organized. You don't have to be like me, marching every other day in heels and organizing some shit. Like, conserve yourself if you can. But what would it mean to have a political education? What would it mean to work with TPF to create an event? What would it mean to create artwork and not just writing Black Lives Matter on the road and the car is just riding all over it? That's not what we're talking about. But something impactful that affects people, that inspires people, right? We have to be consistent. And I'm gonna stop after this. It doesn't matter if we had one big movement last summer. That's cute. We need to have movements all the time if we want to make an impact. Because then, if we don't, it's just a memory that you had instead of it being part of our life. We are fighting for our lives. There are people who call 911 and are killed by the same cops that they called to help them. There were several cases like that. Several in New York City. Elders who feel sick, who have a stove issue, and the cops shoot them. In New York City, the NYPD responds to 3 main calls, and don't let the media fool you and make you think that it's for drug raids and that's not what's happening. They're responding to interpersonal violence, meaning if me and Mia get into it, we're not gonna get into it, but if me and Mia gets into it, that's one, right? Intimate partner violence, as in domestic violence, okay? And emotional mental distress. These are the calls that police are responding to. I don't know if y'all seen, you can call an EMT and police will come, right? Automatically. Because police are first responders. Even though they kill people and don't care to their wounds, they're first responders. They're supposed to, right? I'm gonna give you a case of Saeed Vassal. And everything's connected. A gentrifier called the police on a community member that everybody knew, who was neurodivergent, right? Meaning he was a comrade who had mental illness. But everybody knew him in the community but her. She claimed that he was terrorizing the community, even though nobody had a problem with him. Police came, did not Mirandarize him, meaning you have the right to remain silent. Didn't do any of that. Shot him in front of his son. Okay? There are stories like that that happen all the time. In fact, the statistics have gone up for people who have emotional mental distress crises that interact with police end up dying. There's a case of Mohammed Ba. He was going through a spiral. His mother did not know what to do. She called 911. The police came, killed him in his room, and left. There's an epidemic here. And there is room for discussion about community safety and what that looks like and what collectivism looks like. But I'll stop there.
Thank you both so much for the very powerful and clear messages that you both brought here. I know I said there would be audience Q&A, but I am a pretty selfish moderator. And so I have 2 questions that I want to ask. One is for Gio and one is for Kerbie. And so I want to start with Gio. If you could talk a little bit more about, you mentioned the alternatives to policing that you've seen and talk about in your book, both domestically and internationally. And I was just wondering if you could go into some depth about that.
Thank you so much for your words as well, and I'll start right there actually, right? Because one of the, if we're talking about domestic alternatives, and again, these exist at many levels, they should exist and we should be building them and constructing them at many levels, and by levels I mean locally up to nationally, by levels I also mean autonomous from the state, but also engaged with and making demands of the institutions, right? Because I think those, one thing that needs to be understood is that we can build these alternatives, but also the police are taking our resources, billions of dollars that need to be taken back, that need to be redirected into community alternatives. There are many statistics that could be cited, but the one that really always just stands out to me and blows my mind is the fact that if you are suffering a mental health crisis, you are 16 times more likely to be killed by police. That is the highest of any individual demographic that you can find when it comes to police violence. Although the disproportionate violence that's inflicted on, whole sectors of society is also true. And that's why institutions like the CAHOOTS model, which was developed out in Oregon but has been spreading across the country, is crucial, because it's a question of diverting 911 calls away from the police entirely, keeping the police out of communities, keeping their hands out of communities, and keeping these emergency calls away from the police, sending in not sort of institutional mental health workers, but sending in people who are trained at de-escalation and trained at crisis intervention. And as a result of that, you've seen the police murder rate, in Eugene, where the model was developed, drop to zero, essentially. And the good thing is that immediately after the rebellions last year, hundreds of cities immediately began to reach out to try to figure out if they could establish this kind of alternative. This is just one piece. The other pieces that exist, of course, are on the local level. Many community organizations, safe spaces that are already connected to each other that provide these alternatives. Because again, the question is fundamentally, how is it that we can make it unnecessary for the police to be called into communities, right? In other words, when there is conflict, when there is the potential for violence in communities, how is it that we can resolve those questions within communities without resorting to violence, without resorting to the police? Even small gestures, right? If you need to file a police report, you don't have to call the police to your home to do it. You can go down to the police station if you have an insurance claim, if your car got stolen or whatever else. You can do things, small things that keep the police out of the community, that don't invite them to become, to come into contact with any community members. And as Mariam Kaba puts it, I think quite rightly, anything that keeps the police further away from communities is a good change. Anything that pulls them back, that withdraws their power, is something that we should embrace and something that we should engage in. Internationally, again, as I said, one of the main things that I try to do in the book is insist that not only is policing a global structure, but also resistance to it is global as well. And I look at, different models, for example, in Northern Ireland, the development of alternative justice models that are alternatives to the police and alternatives to the state, that try to resolve things collectively through, discussion and mediation. I look at models for community self-defense, particularly in Venezuela and in Mexico, where, in the midst of, of the brutal violence of the drug war, community members got together, took up arms, and drove out both the police and the narco-traffickers, the cartels, right? And governed their own communities, and to control the safety for their own communities. These are very, very difficult situations, because it's not always pretty, because the complexities of what kind of power then replaces the police is a debate that, as Kerbie mentioned, we're going to have. We're going to have to figure that out. Ideally, what we're talking about is building local grassroots democratic structures that are able to mediate these questions, but that are also able to keep communities safe. And I think if we avoid those questions, if we act as if, oh no, as soon as we get rid of the police, everything will be good, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice, because what we really need to be doing is thinking seriously and taking seriously what's going on in our world, the kind of world we live in, the way that that world does perpetuate violence, create violence, and leave communities vulnerable. People keep calling the police because they really don't have alternatives. Now, it doesn't add up, because the police do not actually provide that safety, right? And we're talking about 2% of crimes being solved, and that's assuming that solving the, so-called solving a crime by making an arrest does anything for the community, when it doesn't actually. But those numbers should be enough for us to realize that not only is it true that calling the police doesn't help, but we also need to be able to build these institutions so that people don't continue to do so, right? And that's part of the question, I think, is how do we do that? How do we build, collectively? And bringing the international piece into it, for me, really sheds light on some of the main questions, because sometimes we hear the argument that it's the poorest and most vulnerable communities that need the police the most, right? And this strange argument from the perspective of sort of risk and like vulnerability that is mobilized to prevent us from making more ambitious claims to power. And I think, part of what, when you look at different parts of the world that have thrown the police out entirely, that's some of the most dangerous places you could imagine. That's places where people really hit their breaking point, in the middle of a civil war or in the middle of the drug war. And and said, you know what, we can do this better. And ultimately, the question is the opposite of what we're often told, because it's precisely those communities that are most vulnerable in the US that need urgently a change, right? That are used as a sort of alibi for the police to perpetuate their presence. And this sort of magic that Kerbie mentioned, where they fail every day and they continue to fail and they fail worse and worse and worse, and yet it becomes an argument for more power, right? So there's this argument that there's this claim that there's this spike in homicides nationwide. I mean, we need to be critical of that. In Philadelphia, it's definitely true, though. It's got nothing to do with defunding, of course. But what I want to point to here is the fact that somehow the fact that violence is going up is not evidence that the police are failing. It's evidence that we need more police. When you could look at it as the opposite and say, well, why, given all of the police in the city of Philadelphia, where I live, for example, why would violence be going up? And how would then more police somehow solve that problem when we know that it doesn't? The question is breaking out of that mindset as well and thinking about different ways of approaching these questions, real community safety and what that would look like.
Thank you so much, you. And then I wanted to get into, Kerbie, your work with Akai Gurley's family, and just thinking about, for anybody who's been part of a sort of anti-police or anti-PIC system struggle, if we could talk about this point of collectivism, of what building community relationships and networks look like to both build momentum for the struggle, but also a sustainable struggle.
So Akai Gurley was killed November 20th, 2014 in the Pink Houses, which is a NYCHA complex in East New York. And with Akai's case, he was failed by NYCHA, and he was failed by the justice system. So it was both. In the Pink Houses, the building that he was in, the elevator did not work. He went down the stairs. The stairwell was not lit. He was going down the stairs to go home. Peter Liang and his partner, Landau, were doing an illegal vertical patrol. So that means that the police officers were going up the staircase in that building with their guns drawn. There was no sign of danger. They just had their guns drawn. Peter Liang heard a sound. Instead of calling out, he shot into the stairwell. He hit Akai in the chest. He left Akai bleeding on the ground. He went to pick up his bullet shells. He argued with his partner and called his union rep. Akai lay dying in the stairwell. The woman that he was with was getting instructions from a neighbor who heard the shots to do CPR, even though NYPD are first responders. And she was sucking blood out of his mouth while he choked on his own blood, and then he died. I'm sorry, trigger warning. I did rapid response the next day after Akai was killed. A comrade of mine called me and said, hey, there was a shooting out in Brooklyn. I reached out to organizers that I knew in the area. So I reached out to a comrade named Joe Maher. I reached out to a comrade of mine who's now EMT, Jody. I reached out to folks who have done Cop Watch, and I reached out to Asede, who has a collective home in East New York called Crystal House. When we went out there, it was one camera. It was like 10 people outside only. It was Melissa, who was with him the night that he died, and the Barons, which are Charles and Inez Barron. For anybody who knows electeds, probably some of the most progressive electeds in New York City. After that situation, I was kind of disappointed, right? This is after Mike Brown was killed. This is after Eric Garner was killed. But there wasn't anybody out in East New York. I don't know if anybody has been to East New York before. East New York is kind of a desolate place in Brooklyn. It's a food desert. People who go out there are people who live there. Very impoverished community. It's being gentrified by Pratt. I have no idea how Pratt is gentrifying East New York. Anyway, whatever. That's a whole nother panel. What started to happen was I started door knocking. I didn't know the family yet. I didn't know them yet. But I started door knocking. I didn't know Akai either. I was like, no, this is crazy. This man was killed like this. Nobody's doing anything. We knocked on every door in the pink houses. We knocked on every door in that neighborhood. And we heard so many stories, right? People who were like, yeah, the cops killed my kid 5 years ago. The cops beat up my kid last month. They harass us all the time. They're always patrolling our building like that. They never want to fix the repairs. They don't even take out the trash. There's always cops everywhere, right? And this is just us knocking on doors and talking to people. They weren't prompted to say anything to us. The fact that we went out there and cared enough to talk to them was enough for them to like let us know what was going on. We started organizing events. We didn't call any actions in Union Square. We didn't call any actions in Times Square, which we know are popular places to call actions. We kept it in the community where the crime happened. And when I say crime, I mean Peter Liang killing Akai. And Sean Landau also being accomplice to Akai's death. That is the crime I'm talking about. We organized huge marches. We organized huge speak outs. I connected with so many different police brutality families. And it was actually the day of the funeral that I heard from Hortensia Peterson, who's Akai Gurley's aunt. She's a union lady. She works with 32BJ at CIU. Holla for anybody who knows about unions. And she said, we just buried Akai. I see that you're organizing. I don't know what to do, but can we meet? And that's how we started organizing for Akai. That is literally how it started. And literally we would meet at Crystal House. We would plan our actions. We would plan speak outs. We would plan our literature together. Auntie is somebody who is very pious, very religious. Goes to Bible study on Tuesday, goes to church on Sunday, right? And one of the things that she says is that if Akai wasn't killed, I probably wouldn't be organizing. A lot of the families say the same thing, that if their family member wasn't stolen from them by a police officer, they would not be organizing. That is the anchor that pulled them into the work. They're part of a club that they did not ask to be a part of. They did not ask for that membership, right? And in that work, well, there was a documentary made about the Akai Gurley case that was on PBS that I was in, and I didn't realize that I was literally navigating coalition work between 20 to 30 organizations in New York City. That's how massive the case was. We partnered with our comrades in CAV. CAV is an Asian solidarity group. I don't know if folks have heard of CAV before. They were here today. And the reason why is because Peter Liang was an Asian officer. There was a lot, and this is why study is important. There was a lot of division where people were like, well, he's being scapegoated because he's Asian. And what people need to understand is that when a police officer puts on their uniform, they are no longer your family member. They are no longer your partner. They are no longer your lover. They are no longer your son. They are a member of the organization called the NYPD. And they operate as such. So if your brother, who is a cop, has an order to arrest you, he will. Period. And he was doing what he was trained to do, right? And moving in the biases that the institution of the NYPD allows to exist, right? That I can have my gun drawn in an impoverished community building, even though there's no violence happening. It's okay, right? And we built so much momentum around the case. We built such a massive scale of coalition work, both with nonprofits, with electeds, with folks on the ground, with independent organizers, with artists, that the case went to trial in a year. He died in 2014, and in 2014 we were in court. We got the verdict in 2015. And people were like, congratulations. And I was like, holding my breath. I said, hold up, because we got sentencing day. And the judge completely blindsided everyone. One of the things that happens when you're doing this work, for anybody who wants to do it, you know, the family was like, I don't want to work with Al Sharpton. That's what they told me. I didn't tell them to say it. And part of the reason why is because of the idea of clout from suffering, popularity from a big case, right? And the folks that were put in the forefront were the family members. So what does that mean? I was doing speaking points with the family when we had press conferences, when we had speak outs, when we had rallies, literally prepping, just like how you prepare for a speech or a presentation or a PowerPoint, literally working with every family member to get them ready, right? When you enter this work, you become a social worker. What does that mean? I would get calls at 10 o'clock at night from a family member who's devastated, crying because they lost their family member and they're tired and they don't want to struggle anymore. And you have to give them the strength, even though you're tired. You become a teacher. You let them know, hey, it's not just you. You aren't the only one that experienced this. And Auntie in this club met so many families. She met the family of Sean Bell. She met the family of Eric Garner. She met the family of Nicholas Haywood, Daron Smalls, and it goes on. And she met all of them, right? And got her strength from them. One of the things that she told me is that, you know, a few years ago, you know, Kerbie, I never had time to grieve yet for Akai because she buried him and then went to struggle for him. There is no time to decompress, right? I've been working with the Gurley family now for 7 years. We recently launched a campaign, and we got a street named after Akai in the same area that he was killed by the NYPD. He will be immortalized in that community. The street naming is happening this month, actually. And for the family who thought that nobody would care for the case after a year, to see a street named after their loved one who was killed by police. How many times do we see a name in the news when it's a top story, when it's trending, and then it disappears, and we never hear about it again, right? But what ends up happening is that you build trust with these family members, with folks who are impacted. Because I was working with Auntie, I met so many other families that I work with all the time. Because they trust you to navigate the work and organize with them. But then they become organizers. Folks who were never political, who considered themselves apolitical. Auntie's like, I'm an abolitionist. The woman who went to church 5 times a week and never organized anything can now talk to you about abolition, can now talk to you about liberation, can now talk to you about the police budget, because she grew through struggle, through her pain. But it took a village to get her there, right? There were times when it's just a little emotional. There are times when we were surrounded by officers. Surrounded. And she stood tall, and family members stood tall because they felt so empowered by the people that were there because of the movement that we built around this family and around so many other families, right? And I think that's something that we don't think about, how our presence impacts the work, impacts the people who are moving through this work, right? And when I talk about consistency, imagine a case ending 6 years ago and still working with the family, right? Auntie does mutual aid work. She gives some food and supplies out to community. That's how she's thinking. She's thinking in a collective sense. She's thinking about de-escalation, which is work that I do at the Audulor Project. So my work is to train businesses, households, organizations in de-escalation so folks don't call the police. To build a network where people know who their community members are, where people know how to de-escalate as a safety tactic to keep people safe. And that's work that family members now know and now understand and teach other family members. They're now mentoring other people who have been impacted by police violence to organize against that violence. All because of the trauma that they experienced, whether it be yesterday or a year ago or years before that. So our impact as organizers, as people who care, can literally shift not just one individual, but communities across the board that we never thought we could before.
Thank you so much, Kerbie. And now, after my 2 questions, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So if anybody has any questions or anything they'd like to share.
Yeah, so great presentation, Kerbie. Great presentation, Gio. I actually have a question for both of you. So, Gio, I always want to speak to you in Spanish because I know you lived in Venezuela. This has to do with Venezuela because you lived there for a while, and I was out there a couple of months ago, and this is pertaining to their structure, their police structure. I mean, Venezuela has a socialist state, a revolutionary socialist state, but is still navigating in this world of capitalism, and they still have contradictions. And, you know, like going to Venezuela and seeing the police there, I thought it was like cool. Like they had it's like revolutionary, very revolutionary police force, but yet they're still the police. So my question is like, how do you view that police structure in Venezuela? Even though it has a revolutionary state, also like Cuba too, they have a police there, but basically your assessment and your view. I mean, you said they have self-trained groups out there in Venezuela as well, the communes and all this other stuff, but if you can get into that. And Kerbie, my question is pertaining towards, like, we have this new mayor now who's a cop that lives in New Jersey, but now he's going to be the mayor of New York. And it's just, yeah, it was really deep because I remember I walked around, and no, I didn't vote for him. I voted for Kathy Rojas, you know, that she got 3rd place, you know, a socialist candidate. So I remember I grabbed a pamphlet for Eric Adams, and I was just like kind of looking at, like, it's kind of funny how he says that he was a victim of police brutality, but yeah, he became a police. It's a weird case, but if you could just break down how you see Eric Adams and how you're gonna what we have to expect under his mayorship with the police, and also I found it interesting you talked about Bitcoin too, so if you could break that down as well.
Thank you so much for the question, and it's really an essential one. Especially when we want to start thinking about police on a global level, as a global structure, we need to really square some circles in the theoretical and in the practical. We need to think our way through some complexities, and I think you put your finger right on it when you talked about contradictions, and when you said and indicated at least that you know Venezuela is not a socialist society, right? It is a profoundly capitalist society in which an experiment in socialism is being undertaken, right? And what that means is that there's actually a war and a deep contradiction within that society that's being played out and has been playing out for decades now. When we project and think about the police on a global level, we need to understand on the one hand that police don't look exactly the same in every case. But on the other hand, if we're talking about police, in other words, if we're talking about a professional force that stands outside of communities and above them, and is and is endowed by the state with using violence against those communities, there's a certain kind of point at which, as you put it, the police are still the police. When Hugo Chavez came to power, the most hated institution in the country was the Metropolitan Police. Brutal, legendary for its violence. And there was, of course, to the point where one of the first things Chavez did is withdrew the police from poor barrios and sent in the National Guard, because people would rather have the National Guard, because the National Guard were more like the community. They were drawn more directly from the community, and they could be trusted more, right? They weren't professional, bringers of violence into their neighborhoods. What followed from that was an incredibly ambitious attempt to transform, reform, and deal with these deep contradictions around policing, with some success, certainly. But I think, also, I always bring up the example because it really shows the limits of what you can do with the police as police, right? Which is, there was an attempt to humanize and revolutionize this sort of national policing force. And yet, despite all the effort, in a capitalist sea, in a capitalist society, these contradictions are always going to reemerge, and the police are going to come to reflect that. And that's why, even if we're very, very interested in what's going on the level of the official police in Venezuela, I think we need to understand that that in conjunction with what's happening on the grassroots level, what's happening with the now 50-year history of armed self-defense movements in those very same poor neighborhoods that kicked the police out, and that for a reason haven't invited the police back in, right? And support the revolutionary government and support the revolutionary process, and actually have played a key role in deepening and radicalizing it. But and these are neighborhoods in the poorest neighborhoods, but which are safer and better governed than some of the richest neighborhoods, because of this long presence of revolutionary organizers. And I guess I'll just end with that, with thinking through what I think is really a conceptual distinction, right? At the point at which the so-called police, even if they call themselves police, become an organic part of the community, that's not police anymore, right? And I say that, in part because it's a question of the process of police abolition and the building of something different. I say it also because, for example, the so-called community police in Mexico, they call themselves police, but they're not. They're community members who patrol and take care of their own community. So I wouldn't call them police, right? And so we are not talking about, again, and this gets back to the strategic question, we are not talking about acting as if the world is a perfect place. Acting as if you take the police out, the community will automatically be safe. No, we're talking about a world in which you need to build something different, right? And when I say that something different is not the police, that's what I mean. It's something in which community members take care of community members.
Okay, so you had like 5 questions in your question. It's okay, I appreciate you. You're meant for who you are. Because he's just so like vibrant. Anyway, so, Malcolm X said the media will have you loving your enemies, right? And that's what Eric Adams represents. Literally the enemy of poor working class people, right? Eric Adams said that even though he experienced police violence, that he joined the police force to stop others from ending up like him. That was his motivation, right? And even though he continued to see all those injustices, it didn't stop him from being any less of a police officer or getting funding from the same institution that continues those violences, right? So it shows like where his interests are. And I said this earlier, but it's like very, very important to uplift this, right? If you are a candidate and you're a benefactor, right, it's the police union. You will support that benefactor's interests. You will support it because that's who put their money behind you, right? He also got money from slumlords, right? So while this city is facing 1 million evictions, housing court is bogged down, that is who he got his funding from. Out of all the candidates, he got the most. So it is clear, actually, that he is the enemy of poor working class people in this city. And that the violence that we experience by the hands of the NYPD, by the hands of ICE, by the hands of landlords are all violences that he will look away from, right? Or he'll cop out to. Or when we go into the streets and organize, he'll steal our slogans to appease us and pacify us and still shake hands with those folks behind our backs. That is how it works. That's why we're talking about systematic shifts, right? When the uprising happened, de Blasio all of a sudden became an abolitionist. I don't know if y'all noticed that. All of a sudden, read a book. I don't know. But was quoting our quotes, right? Like, he was saying, we're going to defund. I mean, literally, like, repeating everything that we said because he had to. Because our movement was so strong that the best option for him was to co-opt it. I don't know if y'all noticed that. All of a sudden, a lot of these big nonprofits, these foundations, all of a sudden cared about police violence in our communities. Who in May, in April, in March, when Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd died, were silent. And that is what we see happen in our movement all the time. The thing with the police brutality movement is that there's always a case. There's always going to be a case. As long as we live in the system, there'll be a case. Because the institution of the police, of the state, are trained and maintain the same I'm sorry, I'm like on my security stuff, and I'm just like looking around, like what's going on? Because they are based off of the same violences that we're talking about, right? And so that's why when we do this work, it's very, very important that you look at it in an anti-capitalist lens. Police are meant to maintain capitalism. Eric Adams is going to uphold capitalism within New York City. That's his job. That's who his friends are. He went to the Hamptons. Who been to the Hamptons? Right? To raise $5 million in one day. To campaign for the 1 month of October. $5 million. He needed $5 million. Right? What would that money do for our communities? What would that money do for TPF? Right? We have to be very, very, very clear that when we're talking about police violence, we're talking about an institution that upholds capitalism by every aspect to its fullest degree. Mayor Bloomberg, who remembers former Mayor Bloomberg? Yeah, he said he has the 7th largest army in the world in the NYPD. Washington Post, you can look that joint up. The 7th largest in the world within the NYPD. These electeds, especially mayors, look at us and our communities as war zones. And so police are trained in that way. There are organizations that train, quotations, police officers to be more sensitive, right? Maybe not beat up so many kids. Maybe not jail so many folks. I'm gonna talk to you about abolition and what you should do, right? There's orgs that do that. And I have heard stories where the police officers come in, they do the training, they don't say not one word, not one. The sergeant might say some things. When he's ready to leave, he gets up, and all the rest of the officers follow him. The NYPD is very hierarchical, very ranking file, right? And there might be one officer that goes back to the facilitator and is like, I do understand what you're saying, and walks away. But he does not feel that he can say that in front of everyone else within the squad. And that is the culture within that institution. Do you understand what I'm saying to y'all? That even if somebody might feel a little different, that they will not go against the blue wall. They will not. And there are officers who wrote their little memoirs about it, who left, and will tell you that they were completely blacklisted because of that. In history, There are more cases of the military joining people's resistance than the police. Historically. Venezuela is an example. Because people within the police force and within the military in Venezuela are radical. They can talk to you about the proletariat of working class people. They will sit down and break it down to you. We don't have that here. And I think that is a big difference between the police there and the police here, where the mentality is that we are all criminals. And they're there to maintain property. And we are all expendable. And that is the same mentality that Eric Adams has. We are expendable to him. Because how dare you talk about cryptocurrency? And the reason why he said that is because he is signaling? Yes, thank you. Whose language? It's all made up. Tech companies that New York City is open for business. That is why he said that. Google has a $7 billion building that is being built in Manhattan that is going to displace community members. That's being built. And Eric Adams' hand is in that. So it goes back to interests. Who do they support? Who do they serve? That's a chant, right? What's the other chant? Get those animals off those horses. That's another one. Anyway. But it shows that he is not on our side. And we have to be very, very, very cautious on who people are when they say that they're here to uplift our struggle. We have to be very conscious. What is it, vetting? Ooh, there's some vetting that needs to happen out here in these streets. Because they show their faces. And Eric Adams got like 25 faces. It's more than 2 faces, it's like 30 face. But it also leaves room for us to know who our targets are when we organize. Is where the strategy part comes in, right? If we're talking about organizing against police violence, right, then Eric Adams has to be a target. And his history has to be constantly exposed and examined and uplifted, right? So what does that look like? Elections just happen. Right? We know what the demographics are. We know who voted for Adams, right? What would it look like to do outreach and go into that community and be like, okay, I know you voted for Adams. Don't worry about how I know. But do you know that he, in fact, is for gentrification in your neighborhood? Do you know that he's actually anti-union, right? Do you know that he's pro more police? Tax dollars that could have went to fixing the roads in our neighborhood, right? And having those conversations and steering people closer to the system and the society that we want to see.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. And we want to respect everybody's time, especially our speakers' time. And so we're going to wrap up with that. But we do have copies of Gio's book at the front. If you buy one quickly, maybe he'll sign it. And we also have displayed is the flyer for the street naming ceremony that Kerbie was talking about. So please take a look. This is very exciting. And
I do want to say really, really quickly, facilitator, please, if I can. You got to respect the chair, always. I do want to say that if folks want to keep in touch, whether it be with Gio's work and writing and whatever project that he has coming up, or want to talk to me more about organizing or any work, please come up to us. Don't just walk away. Let's keep having conversations. Movement means everyone coming together. Collectivism means all of us working together. It's not just one of us. If we all come together and just ask questions, just build for a second, exchange contacts and network, we can accomplish some great things. We're moving into a very new season of struggle. New season. Wasn't it like 90 degrees last week? Anyway, that's a whole nother panel. Whole nother panel. But we're moving into a new time of struggle, and it's very exciting. So please, just come up and talk to us.
I couldn't have said it better. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming.